You're literally learning from the best in the field, literally the best. And we had talks with Brian about a month ago about this Keto Academy, and we couldn't emphasize how important the educational aspect of this truly is. And I'm so thankful that he's put this together, because honestly, it's everything, right? Learning about it, I continue to learn about it. Hopefully, you all are continuing to learn about it, and that's what it's all about. Right? And one of the things I want to also mention is, honestly, how passionate, when you surround yourself with passionate people like these guys, right? Success is inevitable. And that's truly what you guys are here for, right? Success. And that's, I really define success as the difference that you can make in people's lives. Right? And Brian yesterday talked about 5 million servings, right? 5 million. That's 5 million servings, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people being touched by this research being done every single day. So hands to you guys for really getting out there and really showing people and educating. Right? We do research in the lab, right? But going out in the field and really, you guys are getting so many testimonials. We're learning a ton each and every day. So thank you guys for that. Are we getting this loaded up, or 1 second? Go.
Do you have any jokes? Or?
I will say this: before I came up, Brian hands me this sketchy package, and it says "sample chocolate swirl" on it. So I'm jacked up now. You got a nice little chocolate. Anyone had the chocolate swirl? Right? Really good. Tastes like a Tootsie Roll. Really good. Really good. That's good. Awesome. So ultimately, we learned a lot about ketones. We learned a lot about ketogenic dieting, right? Phenomenal talks. We're going to kind of close it out with nutrient programming and some strategies for optimizing body composition. Mainly talking about breakfast, right? How do you optimize that first meal of the day, or when you kind of quote unquote break the fast? How does that work? First off, this is pictures from our new lab that we just built out. It's a 21,000 square foot facility. That's awesome. Thank you. So I think we're going to have another event coming up here sometime in the summer. So we're going to be doing tours of the lab so you guys can see really where a lot of the research and the science is going on. So I'm super excited for that. So you can see here we have a training component. We have virtual reality labs, body composition labs, neurophysiology labs, things where you can look at blood, everything. And this is where we're at 24/7, really trying to learn how to optimize and really study ketogenic dieting, exogenous ketones, and everything like that. So we can look at blood flow, right? Arterial stiffness, how exogenous ketones affect that. One of the things we're really interested in is reaction time, right? Cognitive functioning. So we have different devices where we can look at how, and Dr. Wilson showed some of this data with focus, right? You have people what about athletes or people who are trying to increase their cognitive functioning or reaction time? We can actually look at that with a lot of the devices we have in the lab. But one of my favorite parts of the entire thing is the view. Right outside, it's right on the beach. So I know Michael Rutherford always puts up videos of him in California on the beach, so I had to put that up for him, showing Florida's really good as well. So breakfast, the great predicament, right? Brian woke up this morning and he had to do his workout, and he woke up like this beforehand, right? and oftentimes you see articles like this, and it's kind of conflicting. You see an article where it's like, why you should never skip breakfast, and it's the most important meal of the day. And then you have another one that's like, why you shouldn't eat breakfast. When you look at typical breakfast, if you were me in high school, you'd have something like Fruit Loops, or in my case, 7 bowls of Fruit Loops. That's what I was like. I got to eat to grow, right? So I'd have a ton of Fruit Loops. Or you have something like bacon and eggs as an option. Or oftentimes you see a combination of both, right? A bagel with cream cheese or a bagel with butter. And then even more recently, you see a lot of people putting like the butter in their coffee, right? Like the bulletproof coffee. I thought this was pretty good. A lot of people would freak out about it. But what's really behind that? Is there any evidence behind that? And how can it honestly affect and optimize the rest of your day? So what do most people do? Or really kind of what's typical? One of the things is that 46% of people, they've done surveys, actually skip breakfast, which is kind of interesting. And when you look at what people actually prefer, they prefer bacon and eggs. I mean, who doesn't, bacon, I mean, right? Who doesn't prefer bacon? But when it comes to cereals, people oftentimes, especially with kids, they kind of turn this thing, we're bowled over. A lot of kids are eating more and more breakfast cereals. Frosted Flakes was like the preferred one. I was pretty disappointed in that. I'm more of like a Lucky Charms kind of guy. But I don't know, maybe they'll come out with some lower carb Lucky Charms. It's in the works. So, some considerations for breakfast consumption. First off, when you wake up, one of the first things you think is, do I have time for breakfast? Sometimes you're running late, you're like, I needed that little extra sleep, I need some time. Do I have any time to even eat breakfast? Then, should I eat it? All right, I have time, but you know what, should I eat it? I'm really trying to lose weight, or hey, I'm trying to put on muscle, should I have breakfast? And then, what should the composition of that breakfast be? Right, so 3 different considerations to keep in mind. One of the things is, should I just grab something on the go, right? should I grab something on the go? Well, there was actually a study done by this in DeVerage, 2008, looked at this situation. And they basically either fed subjects like a McDonald's breakfast, you know, like the Egg McMuffin, or just a traditional breakfast that you might see. And they looked at oxidative stress. Angela and Dr. Dom talked a lot about oxidative stress. Look at these lipid peroxides, which are a big indicator of oxidative stress when you're fed that McDonald's diet, right? And we talked about how many people are doing that. How many people are going to work each and every day and are like, wow, I got to stop at McDonald's or Starbucks and grab one of those sandwiches real quick. And they do that all the time. That's what it should be like, right? That's what it should be like. Maybe if you take off the bread and you have the sausage and the cheese, maybe that's an option. And why is this the case? And I know this may look overwhelming, but I'll just explain this real quick. This was some really interesting study done by Wolf in 1996. What happens when you ingest carbohydrates, right? If you look up here, you ingest carbohydrates, you increase the insulin. We talked a lot about insulin today. The insulin to glucagon ratio, and you increase something known as malonyl-CoA. You know, just remember malonyl-CoA. Well, if you look on the other side, when you ingest something like fats, which is going to be the sausage part of that Egg McMuffin, you need something known as CPT1, which is a transporter for the fats to be broken down. You need that. Well, when you ingest carbohydrates, you kind of inhibit CPT1 from doing its job. So typically when fats need to get broken down, there's CPT1 is there to kind of unlock the door to let fats go into the mitochondria to be broken down. What happens when you have high fat and high carb at the same time? It kind of locks it. It doesn't allow that door to be opened, and so you can't allow those fats to be broken down. So unfortunately, you get a lot of fat storage, right? So that's typical American. That's a typical American diet right now, right? Having burgers with the buns and having these sausage, Egg McMuffins, things like that. That's kind of what's going on a molecular level. So if you're on the go, especially with breakfast, make sure at least you're not having those carbohydrates, high carbohydrate and high fat at the same time. Go with something like eggs, bacon, sausage, and we'll go into more options here in a little bit. So what are the main reasons for eating breakfast? Again, we have this conundrum where a lot of people are like, main reasons you're not losing weight is because you don't eat breakfast. And then other people are like, well, breakfast isn't really the most important meal of the day. What should you really do? When it comes to breakfast, one of the things is we want food, right? People wake up in the morning and they're hungry, oftentimes. So one of the things is to, one, satisfy hunger, and we talked a little bit, it was a little bit mentioned about the satiating effects especially when you're on a ketogenic diet and you're in ketosis, definitely some satiating effects, which we'll touch on at the very end. The most important meal of the day, people feel like they need to have it to kind of fire up and start their metabolism. And a lot of people are afraid of burning muscle. They're like, well, if I don't eat, I'm going to like lose muscle. Especially me. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose muscle, right? I don't have much to begin with, so I got to keep whatever I have. So that's me. I'm afraid of it. We want food when we wake up in the morning. So what about skipping breakfast? Do you compensate later on in the day? That's one of the biggest questions that people come across is, do you compensate later on in the day? Well, a lot of times it depends on your body composition. Leaner individuals, here they show that leaner individuals didn't necessarily compensate more later on in the day when they skipped breakfast. However, when you look at obese individuals, when they completely skipped breakfast, they actually seem to compensate more at lunch and at dinner, and they actually increased their sugar intake, right? Which could be a pretty big issue. Could be a pretty drastic issue for them later on in the day, especially when they're starting to crave sugar later on in the day. So how do you combat that, right? How do you have something earlier on in the day where they're not kind of compensating later on? This quote is really good, and Dr. Stu Phillips is a really good researcher. He's doing some really good stuff with training. Saying an obese person needs to eat less and exercise more is like saying have a nice day to someone with depression. It's insane how many MDs and how many doctors will go, oh, it's a simple equation, just eat less, move more. It's like if it were only that simple, right? And it's not. It's complex. And satiety regulation has a drastic impact on that. And if we can increase satiety and we can increase people feeling fuller and not having to eat as often and as frequently, that is a huge, huge aspect that people often overlook, right? So the type of breakfast seems to matter. Here we'll touch on two different studies. So, this is a study done by Vanderwall in 2008. And basically they did an isocaloric either bagel versus an egg. So basically a higher fat versus a higher carb breakfast. And basically they found that the higher fat egg breakfast had a higher satiating effect. So they were fuller longer throughout the entire day. Going back to the importance of people feeling fuller and less hungry the entire day. They had decreased energy consumption over the course of the entire day. And ultimately what that led to was increases in weight loss, decreases in body fat, and just overall better feeling of wellness. It's really, really interesting, right? Just by the composition of their breakfast can drastically change their body composition. Really, really interesting. And then even with exercise, people go, oh, well, that was a non-exercising condition. Those were just sedentary people. Well, this study just came out in 2015. Even with exercise, they took 25 men and women and had them do a 12-week resistance training program. Similar concept. They fed them a higher fat egg versus a higher carbohydrate bagel breakfast. They found very similar results. And basically they found that insulin sensitivity went up, and we talked about how important insulin sensitivity is incredible. Incredible. Insulin sensitivity went up, which is what we want. Plasma triglycerides went down with a higher fat breakfast versus a higher carbohydrate. Right? So again, kind of more evidence to suggest that having higher fat in the morning seems to be way better than higher carbohydrate. This is Ben Pekulski. We work with Ben. Obviously, you can see he has a lot of muscle, but this is his breakfast, which is absolutely amazing. He's 2 pounds of ground beef, cooked in some coconut oil with some vegetables, right? And it's amazing. He's a huge advocate of having like a higher fat, lower carbohydrate breakfast, and it makes sense, right? It makes sense. So why? This is the main thing. Why do higher fat, lower carbohydrate foods for breakfast seem to be ideal? At first, you don't want to be like that, right? You don't want to be like that throughout the entire day, first off. But what's the mechanism? What's really going on? So what if I could tell you that evidence suggests as Angela would say, evidence suggests that if you have fat earlier on in the day, you can program your metabolism to use fat as fuel kind of for the rest of the day, right? Wouldn't that be pretty interesting? Just by the first meal that you have, you can kind of program and have this kind of the term that's known as metabolic flexibility throughout the entire day. And that would be pretty cool. Be pretty cool. In society right now, we kind of have it backwards. A lot of people are having like super high carb for breakfast. Well, what's going on? This was a study done by Molly Bray's lab out of the University of Alabama in 2010. They did two different things. They had one group that had high fat upon waking, and so they basically had, that's bacon. They had high fat upon waking, and then they had carbohydrates, like carbohydrates later on in the day. The other group had higher carbohydrates early on, something like a cereal first thing in the morning, and then they kind of looked at their response to higher fat later on in the day. Well, what they found was really interesting. You talk about metabolic flexibility. One of the things is when you have high fat early on in the morning, they were able to respond better to different challenges later on in the day. On the contrary, those who had the higher carbohydrate cereal-like breakfast weren't able to respond as well later on in the day. They had impaired metabolic flexibility. And that's huge for body composition, huge for health implications, right? So here we're kind of looking at that. When we look at when we talk about RER, Dr. Volek showed some stuff on RER. 0.7 is what's known as kind of like fat burning, like you're using fat primarily as fuel. 1 is primarily like carbohydrate, sugar-based metabolism, right? You're kind of using carbohydrates as fuel. Where the arrow's pointed, you can see the ones that had higher fat earlier in the day were burning and utilizing more fat throughout the entire day, not just the morning, the entire day. What's that going to lead to as far as body composition? Right? Greater fat loss. And that's what you see here. They kind of looked at body composition. You had the ones who had a high fat breakfast versus a high carb breakfast. High fat breakfast had lower body fat, and they actually tend to have slightly higher lean body mass. Really, really interesting. Just by the composition of their first meal of the day can have that drastic of an impact, right? So what's that mean? It's basically, like we said, high fat upon waking is associated with an increased ability to respond to different challenges later on in the day, whether that be some carbohydrates, whether that be fat. Meanwhile, a high carbohydrate upon waking kind of fixes your metabolism to primarily using carbohydrates. So you wake up, you have cereal for breakfast, and later on in the night you go out with your family, you go out to have like a nice steak. You're not able to respond as well to that steak just because of what you had first thing in the morning, right? Remember we talked about that shuttle? That lock is still in play hours after the effect. Right? It's crazy, and unfortunately that's what a lot of people are locked into, is kind of this carbohydrate-based metabolism when it kind of needs to be the opposite. So what's the mechanism? One of the things, without going into too much detail, one of the hormones that we talk about is something known as adiponectin. And adiponectin seems to be really important for insulin sensitivity. And the name of the game is trying to increase insulin sensitivity and becoming more and more efficient. So with having higher fat, lower carbohydrates earlier on in the day, you actually increase adiponectin, which is important for insulin sensitivity and various other health markers. So really, really important. That's kind of the mechanism that we think is going on. This is brand new data from the lab. This is kind of how we measure metabolism, and you can see that it looks like an astronaut, right? You get a little hood around them, and it's pretty cool because it kind of collects all the gases that are going on inside of it. So when that person is laying down there breathing, we can collect all the gases they're expelling, and we look at the carbon dioxide, oxygen, and that can kind of tell us that RER, whether they're using fat as fuel or whether they're using more carbohydrates as fuel. So one of the things we did, if anyone knows or follows Dr. Wilson, social media. One of the things he loves and he showed is to make all these different kinds of recipes. So we do a lot of different recipes for breakfast. My favorite is the pancakes. He has this chocolate mousse, which is like a keto-friendly chocolate mousse, which is awesome. It's got MCTs in it, heavy cream, some dark unsweetened cocoa. It's really, really good. So we looked at that versus kind of like a moderately, like a low carb, moderate fat, something like a nut butter mixed with some protein versus cereal. So we kind of just did it in a couple of people, some brand new pilot data. And basically what we found was very similar results to Molly Bray. In that the keto mousse, even several hours after the challenge, after we fed these individuals, their RER was much lower, thus indicating higher fat utilization, when they had lower carbohydrates compared to the one all the way to the right, which is a cereal-based breakfast. They're still locked into this carbohydrate-based metabolism hours after they had the cereal, which again indicates that lower carbohydrate, there seems to be this kind of threshold for having these lower carbohydrates to kind of allow you to adapt and lock into that fat metabolism. Again, going on, is there a threshold? So yes, and unfortunately, it seems to be dose dependent. And I wish I knew this now, going back, because literally I would eat 7 bowls of Lucky Charms in the morning, and I'm like, dang. I was like, I really wish I knew this, but there does seem to be a threshold. The higher the amount of carbohydrates you have earlier on in the day, the higher the lipogenic activity, which we don't want. Lipogenic activity is not good. But the lower the carbohydrates, obviously you don't have that same effect. So again, there does seem to be a threshold. The higher you continue to go, the worse off it is. So going and having like the unlimited pancakes from IHOP probably isn't a good idea to do first thing in the morning. Now, what about a fat fast? This is, we talked about intermittent fasting, which is a really interesting, really novel new concept that we're kind of looking at as far as body composition. These are some infographics we had made up on the Muscle PhD Academy that we're doing on some social media, and kind of looking at the different effects of intermittent fasting. But the question becomes, can you still eat and allow for some of these fasting adaptations? What's kind of quoted as a fat fast. Is that possible? One of the things I like to look at, and we were meeting with some guys out in California, and we were talking about the concept of intermittent fasting. And it's kind of a rough term, because when people hear fasting, they think restrictive, right? They think, oh, it's restrictive. So I kind of like the term like rhythmic feeding or intermittent feeding. It's a whole different approach to kind of put on rather than intermittent fasting. And we know about the benefits of fasting. Dr. Dom talked about a lot of the benefits of fasting, kind of how this all started, and this whole with epileptics, and that's kind of where it all originated. Ton of benefits from fasting. We know that you get beneficial metabolic effects, reduced insulin resistance, and increased glucose tolerance. And there's even some new data, and we've been talking about this a lot today. We talked about it in the Vegas event, talked a lot about here, and I'm sure we'll continue to talk a lot about it on the importance of gut health. And the importance of good microbiota. Dr. Dom posted an article the other day on how the gut microbiota is being looked at now in cancer, right? It's amazing kind of where that realm's going as far as gut health and optimizing it, and how that's going to have effects. And we'll see more and more and more as it's coming out, and we're just in its infancy. One of the questions is, can you fat fast? Right? And this is a really interesting concept that we came across. It may be the reason why we're seeing all these beneficial effects with having the higher fat, lower carbohydrate breakfast. And this study kind of does a great job of explaining it. This is a study done by Dr. Wolf. And basically what we're looking at here is they had 2 groups. They had one that completely fasted, which was the control group. They fasted for 84 hours, right? It's a rough time, 84 hours. The other group had lipid infusion, where they had fat as all of their calories. They had fat versus completely fasting. And what you're looking at here to the right, first off on the left, you're looking at triglyceride oxidation, the same in both groups. What you're looking at here is glucose and free fatty acids. In both conditions, both glucose was suppressed to the same extent, and free fatty acids were actually higher, slightly higher in the lipid group. What does this mean for, you guys recognize this, acetoacetate and beta-hydroxybutyrate? You look at both of them had elevated levels of each one of these. Now again, think about this. One is actually having some calories, the other one's completely fasting. Very interesting, right? And then you look at insulin, which we know how the importance of that, and both of them suppress insulin to the same degree. So that brings about the question is, rather than completely restricting, is there a way that you can kind of get some of these benefits without having to completely restrict or completely fast? And the answer seems to indicate is yes. Kind of having that lower carbohydrate threshold seems to be extremely important and can mimic that effect. And their takeaway was this: our results demonstrate that carbohydrate restriction, not the presence of negative energy balance, is responsible for initiating the metabolic response to fasting. That's straight from the paper, right? Really interesting. So the carbohydrate restriction seems to be the important aspect for the metabolic effects that you're seeing from the fasting, right? Really, really interesting stuff. The last thing we're going to touch on is ketosis, ketones, and satiety. And everyone discussed this before, but who's experienced with taking keto OS? Who's experienced like higher satiety and not feeling as hungry? Right? So here's kind of the reason. Here's kind of a potential explanation. When we talk about ketosis, there's some different effects, and it's really interesting. One of the effects, and when you look on this on the right side, the anorexigenic effects, the mechanisms include increasing circulating post-meal free fatty acids, and something known as CCK and ghrelin. And these could be explaining a lot of those effects. And going back to the previous statement by Dr. Stu Phillips, with the whole analogy, this satiety is everything now with trying to control weight loss and the obesity epidemic and a lot of the metabolic issues that we're having today. If we can increase satiety and have people eating less and kind of suppressing people's appetites, that's huge. That's a huge component. Granted, we need more research on this for sure. But you guys are seeing a lot of this. This is the mechanism for how ketogenic dieting and inducing this state of ketosis really can affect that hunger mechanism and really feed back into it. So really, really cool stuff. So take homes, kind of a higher fat, lower carbohydrate breakfast seems to be optimal for programming your metabolism to utilize fat throughout the entire day. And Dr. Wilson had mentioned kind of talking about ketones as those water-soluble kind of fourth macronutrient, water-soluble fats. That could be a good time to implement something like Keto OS or the Keto Cream. I know that's a new product that's coming out, but that's really huge. That's kind of driving into this whole concept of that metabolic programming is having lower carbohydrate, higher fat. Those could be two viable options. So a fat fast, something like Keto OS, Keto Green, seems to mimic several of the effects that straight fasting has, meanwhile allowing you to get something into your system and really feel satiated. That way you're not starving throughout the entire day and potentially eating more later on. So the real question that I always leave you guys with is, are you ready to change the world?
Yeah.
All right, anybody have any questions for Ryan? Yes, ma'am.
I'm Terry Baker. We're from Lowery, Florida. Relative to beans and legumes, which is going to be high carb, but high fiber. And for some of us who, when I nap, when I do the master meal protein, I don't have a craving for beans, and I find that I do pretty well with the beans. But now, how's this going to play into the carb, fiber, balance of keeping it down. Does that make sense?
Yeah, great question. Well, beans are interesting because, like you said, they are high in fiber. One of the things that we do know is this. Do you consume Keto OS with it? No. So one of the things that we've actually found, and I forgot to mention this in our lab, was some people talk about that, like in the morning, they're like, can I still have some carbohydrates? One of the things that we found, and this was, I don't even think we presented this, was that when you have ketones, so we did a study where we did ketones, we did glucose, and then we did glucose plus ketones, and we looked at RER. When you have ketones, RER was at like 0.7, right, indicating fat utilization. When you have glucose, it's at like 1, right, which is typical, that's what we expected. When you combine ketones plus glucose, you actually see somewhere in the middle. So it actually brings down the RER to indicate more fat utilization, which is really interesting. So potentially having that alongside of this can kind of augment and kind of get those adaptations that we're talking about. But the fiber aspect is extremely important, and that's one of the things, like I know oftentimes, like when we travel a lot, Dr. Wilson and I travel a lot, and I have Keto OS a lot of times when we travel, but if we're like in Vegas, especially, when I'm in Vegas, it's very tough to pass up a buffet. He knows I love the buffets in Vegas, they're amazing. But one of the things I have to do is rather than just eat straight eggs and bacon, which is great, I have to get like some kind of salad or some vegetables in it, because the fiber component is something that's often overlooked, especially when you're trying to do a ketogenic diet or even low carbohydrate. People often forget the whole fiber aspect, but that's just as important as getting that fat high. You definitely need to maintain that fiber content. So that's a great point.
Chris from Orlando. I'm curious, what do you suggest for people who are slow losers? Really slow. The inches are coming up, but they're not seeing anything on the scale. And they're saying, wait, this isn't really working. More exercise? What kind of exercise?
Throw the scale away.
I like that.
Yeah.
So that's a good point. So the scale, I'm not a big fan of the scale, and Dr. Wilson and I get asked this all the time, is that my weight's not really changing, and a lot of times we've seen it. We've done numerous DEXAs and body composition things, and people all the time will go, well, I started this diet. I started at 150 pounds, and now I'm like 155. I'm freaking out. And you put them on a DEXA, and they actually gained muscle and lost fat. Dr. Volek showed some phenomenal data with these extreme responders. And those people might get on a scale and go, oh man, I didn't lose as much as I wanted to. But they gained a ton of muscle, which is way more important than the number that's on the scale. One of the things that we study a lot is kind of high intensity interval training, and Dr. Wilson mentioned it, and it's going to vary by the person, and I think that's a great way to kind of help alongside resistance training. I think resistance training is extremely important, especially for muscle and keeping that aspect. But high intensity interval training, whether that be brisk walking, whether that be running uphill, one of my favorites is cycling, and doing some kind of cycling I think can really help. But like he said, the scale is okay. I'm not a big fan of it. I'd rather you know your own body, and you know kind of how it's adapting, and I'll just go and how you're feeling and your aspect, and as long as you're confident and happy with it, that's the most important thing I'd say.
Flora from Arbondale, and my question is, what about those of us that are not hungry in the morning and choose to use our drink mid-morning and then wait until we're hungry and enjoy 2 meals later in the day? Is that?
Absolutely, that's great. And that's kind of what I was saying, is that the Keto OS, it has MCTs in it, which are that fat, and it's got the ketones, which are like fat-soluble, water-soluble fats. So that kind of programming is exactly what we're talking about. So that's a great idea. I think we were talking to Abigail the other day, and she's kind of got this whole system, and that's kind of what we're working on, is building this entire system where it's like, hey, in the morning you can have something like the keto cream or the Keto OS, and then have like a nice hearty salad for lunch, and then make sure you're staying on track for dinner and having something kind of before you go to bed. But that's a phenomenal way to go about it.
Melissa from Riverview, Florida. What if you have a customer or somebody who like has gallbladder issues and can't do the high fat? What would be a good resolution for that?
Yeah, we've actually worked with individuals like that. I'd say for them staying moderate, kind of more like in between, just lower carb is going to be the way to go with them. We haven't seen anything negative, and Dr. D'Agostino has done a lot of safety work, especially in the mice, with the actual supplement itself. So I wouldn't say there haven't been any adverse or negative effects with the supplement, but for that person, I would just say lower carbohydrate. Exactly. Some enzymes can help with that. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
Hi, I'm Rosie from St. Petersburg. Talk about type 1 diabetics, and can they take the ketone supplement?
Yeah, and again, I don't think we've seen anything negative. I just don't see how we haven't seen any data to indicate that taking the supplement would have any adverse effects for any of those conditions. Whether we can't say it would treat or have any curing effects on anything. That's definitely not the route. But if it were to have any adverse effects, I would say I don't think it would.
I heard that type 1 diabetics can't do the diet. Is that true?
No. There's actually some data coming out that there's some research published on type 1 diabetics actually doing it. I think Dr. Dom actually has someone in his lab that does it and plays around with it and actually does it on himself and is seeing phenomenal results. Yeah, that's not, there's limited, there's definitely a lot more research on type 2, but it's limited data, but there is people that are on type 1 that are seeing drastic, incredible results.
You got one more question?
My name is Gloria, and I'm from Auburndale. Whoops. My granddaughter just had her gallbladder taken out, and she was on ketos, and I tried to talk her into staying on it, but she wouldn't. And I'm concerned. I think she should be still on it. Is that a yes or a no? I'm not sure what to tell her, because I think she should be, but then she doesn't think she should be because she doesn't have a gallbladder.
Mm-hmm. And again, it's definitely varies by the individual. I will say this is sometimes you got to look at the benefits, the pros versus the cons, and I think the pros in any of these situations far outweigh any of the cons that would come as a side effect. So I think I would just show. I mean, again, pointing to the research, pointing that hey, these are the benefits of exogenous ketones, elevated levels of ketones, etc. And just educate. The most powerful tool for anyone, and anyone, is going to be the education. And that's huge. I can't emphasize, and that's why I love what's going on here, is that you point them to the education. You say, hey, look at this. This is what's going on. This is it. And I think you saw a large amount of it today. So that's what I would go to, is just point them to the education. And the more they know, the more they can understand, the better off they are.
All right, perfect. Everybody give Ryan a good round of welcome. Thank you so much.